welcome to MoonieGuide. I'm so glad that you're here tonight. Today, we're going to dive into the complicated history of Victorian etiquette. We're gonna be seeing how Victorian dating and all the little rules, gestures, and social rituals worked in that era, how that shaped people, their meetings and little gestures that can make or break your social status. If you've been here before, you know the norm. Write an entry down in the comments of where and what time you're listening from. And if this is your first time, thanks for tuning in and welcome to MoonieGuide. If you enjoy this kind of content, and if it helps you relax, unwind, or just gives you something fun to listen to, go ahead and give us a like and subscribe to show your support. All right, so let's get into it. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of Victorian dating, how people greeted each other, the dances, the gestures, the letters, the gifts, and everything that made it far harder than our current world. How they handled those tricky moments of rejection or awkwardness. We're gonna be looking into a world full of nuance, subtlety, and surprisingly relatable moments from what dating was like in Victorian times. You wake up to the sound of the city before you even open your eyes. It's faint, but it's there. The soft rhythm of wheels on cobblestone, someone calling out to a driver, the muffled strike of a bell from somewhere far away. London, or maybe Bath, or any busy Victorian town starts early. The first thing you notice is the air. It's cool and smells faintly of coal and morning damp. You're lying beneath heavy blankets, the kind people used before central heating. From the hallway comes the gentle clink of china, the rustle of fabric. Someone's already moving around, starting the fire, carrying water, preparing tea. You sit up slowly and it's like stepping into another timeline. The room isn't modern. The walls are covered with patterned paper, flowers, or stripes in muted colors. There's a mirror framed in dark wood, a pitcher and bowl for washing, a neat stack of folded clothes. Everything feels intentional, because in this world, order isn't just about comfort, it's about character. Here, how you live is who you are. Even before breakfast, social rules start to whisper their instructions. Clothes are never thrown on in a hurry. Morning dress has its code, something modest and tidy, not meant to attract attention, but to show that you belong to the world of self-control and respectability. When you leave your room, you can already sense the hierarchy at work. Servants move quietly, eyes lowered, each with a role to play. The household runs like a machine built from manners. A maid might greet you softly, but she'll never begin a conversation unless you do first. In the Victorian home, every gesture has a boundary. Downstairs, the breakfast room is bright with daylight. The table is set neatly. China, silverware, a pot of tea, slices of bread waiting to be toasted over a small rack. There's a newspaper folded beside your plate. It carries a world of detail, shipping reports, parliament debates, announcements of engagements and deaths. People in this era live by information just as we do, but theirs arrives printed, smelling faintly of ink and smoke. You sit, pour tea, listen to the quiet hum of conversation. Nothing here is casual. There's an art even in small talk. You don't dive straight into feelings or opinions. You stay on the surface, polite and safe. Weather, travel, health, society news, that's the rhythm of a Victorian morning. It's easy to think the past was slow, but for them, this was the heartbeat of progress. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything. Trains, telegraphs, factories, modern life was exploding around them. But inside the home, the rules stayed tight, especially the ones that guided how men and women interacted. Soon enough, you'll step outside. The streets are waking. Horses stamp, carts roll, and shopkeepers lift shutters. If you pass another person, you nod, not too warmly, not too coolly. Every meeting is measured, especially between unmarried men and women. Respectability is currency here, and one careless glance can cost you. Victorian dating, or what they called courtship, wasn't about spontaneity. It was about ritual. Romance lived inside walls of etiquette. But before we get to the dances, the letters, and the long walks under supervision, you need to understand the foundation. This world was built on restraint. To the Victorians, love wasn't something you fell into. It was something you earned through conduct. A raised eyebrow at the wrong time, a conversation that lasted a little too long, could lead to gossip, and gossip was dangerous. It could shut doors to families, jobs, invitations, everything. So when people spoke of rules, they meant it literally. The etiquette books of the time, yes, there were books, taught how to address someone, how long to stay when calling, even how far apart to sit on a sofa during a visit. It sounds exhausting now, but back then, those boundaries made people feel safe, even elegant. Imagine walking through a park on a Sunday afternoon. Everyone's dressed properly. Even the children wear little coats and hats. There's a quiet rhythm to it. People strolling, nodding politely, never bumping shoulders. A young couple might pass each other, eyes meeting for half a second. That single glance could be the most daring moment of their week. And if that glance meant something, the next step wouldn't be a text or a date. It would be a visit, supervised, usually in the presence of a chaperone. But that's for later. For now, the morning continues. Someone at the table laughs gently at a story about a neighbor's misbehaving dog. You sip your tea. The world outside keeps turning, smoke rising above rooftops, the sound of hooves mixing with distant church bells. You can almost feel the pace of it settling inside you, steady, deliberate, ruled by manners and appearances. It's a world that believes in order, not chaos. And in that order, romance has to find its quiet, careful way. Now that we've settled into the Victorian parlor, let's talk about greetings, the little moves that could make or break your social life back then. Today, we think of greetings as something casual, a handshake, a nod, maybe a hug if you're close. But in Victorian times, every greeting was a small performance full of meaning. How you moved, what you said, and even how you held your hands all mattered. Imagine walking into a room filled with people. The moment your eyes meet someone else's, you're stepping into a tiny social choreography. The curtsy for women, the bow for men, it wasn't just about respect. It was about showing you knew your place in the social order without being rude or overbearing. Ladies would gather their skirts slightly in one hand, knees bending gracefully, and lower themselves just enough to show politeness. Men would bend slightly at the waist, hands often adjusting a coat or hat, keeping a careful balance of respect and composure. Too slow and it looked awkward. Too fast and it seemed rushed. But here's the thing, it wasn't just about the movement. Timing and eye contact mattered too. Looking someone straight in the eye for too long could feel bold, even improper. Looking away too quickly might seem shy or uninterested. There was a delicate middle ground where everything, from your posture to your glance, signaled exactly how polite and well-mannered you were. Introductions were another tiny drama. You never introduced yourself first if you were a lady. That was considered too forward. Instead, a mutual friend or family member would handle it. "Miss Thompson, may I introduce Mr. Ellis?" That line carried more than just words. It defined social roles. The person introducing others had a kind of authority, setting the tone for the relationship. Men, on the other hand, could sometimes introduce themselves in informal situations, but even then, caution and deference were key. After the initial greeting came the first few words of conversation. Think of this as the verbal part of the dance. Certain topics were off limits until people really knew each other. Asking about money, family drama, or personal problems was considered rude. Instead, polite conversation usually focused on safe areas: books, theater, art, travel, or maybe some mild gossip about the latest social events. Even laughter was controlled. A loud, hearty laugh could make someone seem unrefined, while a small, restrained smile or chuckle showed good manners. There were also little subtleties in how you spoke. Polite people avoided interrupting, even if they had something clever to say. Pauses were allowed, and silence wasn't a problem. It could even show thoughtfulness. Speaking too quickly or too loudly was seen as a sign of impatience or vulgarity. Basically, the goal was to be pleasant and composed, not flashy or overbearing. Handshakes were rare and reserved for more formal situations. Instead, greetings often relied on body language: a nod, a slight inclination of the head, or a small gesture with the hands. Touching someone unexpectedly could be shocking. Even a friendly pat on the shoulder. Big no-no unless you were very familiar with the person. Another important part of greetings was attention to hierarchy. Social rank mattered in every room. A young lady greeting an older lady, for example, needed to curtsy just a little lower, while a gentleman greeting someone of higher social status might bow a bit deeper. It wasn't meant to make anyone feel inferior, at least ideally, but it was a way of showing awareness and respect. Now let's look at one more detail that surprises modern viewers: the exchange of names and titles. People almost always used last names, especially on first meetings. Miss Langley, Mr. Harrington, never just Emily or John. Titles mattered. They reinforced respect and social awareness. And if someone had a special designation, like doctor or lady, you absolutely included it. Forgetting a title could feel like a small insult, so everyone memorized names carefully. Even gestures with your hands carried meaning. For women, gloved hands were normal indoors and gestures had to be delicate. For men, hands were used sparingly, maybe adjusting a coat, tipping a hat, or lightly gesturing while speaking. Everything was about balance, showing attention without overdoing it. Finally, there's the unspoken rule about moving through a room. You didn't just walk up to someone and start a conversation. You scanned the room, made polite eye contact, and waited for an invitation to approach. Sometimes that invitation came in a gesture, a nod, or a simple smile. Once you were accepted, conversation could begin, always careful, always measured. In short, greetings and introductions in Victorian times were like a carefully choreographed dance. One wrong step, one misplaced glance, and the social balance could wobble. But if you followed the cues, curtsies, bows, proper introductions, measured conversation, you navigated the room with grace, respect, and style. And while it sounds formal or strict to us now, for Victorians, it was simply how life worked. They didn't think of it as rigid. They thought of it as polite, elegant, and the socially smooth way to connect with others. Once you've mastered the greetings and introductions, the next step is small talk, the everyday conversation that kept Victorian social life humming. And yes, it might sound simple, but it was actually an art form. The right topic, the right tone, even the right pause could make the difference between being remembered as charming or, well, awkward. Victorians loved safe topics. Books, plays, art exhibitions, or recent travels were perfect. Asking someone about their health or family was okay, but only if you already had a connection. Anything too personal, too forward, or too opinionated could make the other person uncomfortable. So small talk wasn't just about filling silence. It was about creating a sense of comfort, showing that you were thoughtful and polite. One interesting thing is how much attention was paid to listening. Polite conversation wasn't about dominating the discussion. It was about making others feel heard. Interrupting someone was a major faux pas. Even if you had something clever to say, the trick was to wait for the right moment, respond thoughtfully, and keep your tone gentle. Think of it like a dance. You speak, then listen, then respond, always keeping a balance. Another big part of small talk was reading social cues. Body language was everything. A lady might slightly tilt her head, or a gentleman might adjust his gloves or hat. These little movements could signal interest, discomfort, or even boredom. Eye contact was important too. Too much could feel intense, too little could seem distracted. And yes, a polite smile went a long way. The Victorians were masters at picking up on these subtle signs, and you had to do the same if you wanted to navigate a room smoothly. Here's a neat detail. Conversation was often guided by questions that were open, not personal. Instead of asking, "How much does your family make?" which would be scandalous, someone might ask, "Have you read any interesting books lately?" Or "Have you attended any good plays?" These questions were safe, inviting, and allowed the other person to share just enough without oversharing. And gestures mattered too. Leaning slightly forward could show interest, while leaning back might indicate relaxation or disinterest, depending on the context. Gentle hand movements while speaking were okay, but anything too dramatic or fast could seem unrefined. Even posture was a clue. Standing or sitting straight showed attentiveness and poise. There were also subtle rules about humor. A witty comment or clever observation could charm a crowd, but anything crude or sarcastic was avoided. Laughing too loudly, not polite. A soft, restrained chuckle, perfect. Humor was like seasoning, just enough to enhance the conversation but never overpower it. Then came the graceful exits. If a conversation had run its course, you didn't just walk away abruptly. A polite nod, a gentle smile, or a small comment like, "It was delightful speaking with you," was the proper way to leave. Timing mattered here as much as anywhere else. Linger too long, and it becomes uncomfortable. Leave too quickly, and it might seem rude. One thing that might surprise modern viewers is how much attention to details in tone and timing was expected. Pauses weren't awkward. They were a sign of thoughtfulness. Speaking too quickly suggested impatience, too slowly, and it could feel dull. Everything about the way people spoke and moved was designed to communicate calmness, composure, and respect. Even in casual interactions, Victorian social life was like a carefully tuned orchestra. Everyone had a part to play, speaking, listening, smiling, nodding, adjusting posture, showing interest, stepping back when necessary. The goal wasn't just to be polite. It was to create an environment where everyone felt at ease, respected, and entertained by the conversation. And here's a fun thing. While all these rules might seem strict, they actually gave people a kind of freedom. Because everyone understood the expected patterns, you could move confidently through social situations without constantly worrying about missteps. Think of it as a roadmap. You follow the path, add your own personality within it, and suddenly, even a formal parlor conversation feels natural. So mastering small talk in the Victorian era wasn't about being flashy or clever. It was about paying attention, being kind, staying composed, and understanding subtle signals from the people around you. In essence, it was less about impressing others and more about making everyone feel comfortable. And that's a skill that works just as well today as it did back then. After you've mastered greetings and small talk, the next step in Victorian social life, especially for dating, was flirting. And yes, the Victorians flirted, but in a way that might feel incredibly subtle to us. Nothing loud, nothing in your face. Every movement, glance, and gesture had meaning. Think of it as a secret language that only people paying attention could read. One of the biggest tools in a Victorian flirt's toolkit was the eyes. Eye contact was everything, but it had rules. A lady might lower her gaze and then glance up briefly to show interest without seeming forward. A gentleman might catch a lady's eye from across the room, hold it for a moment, then look away gracefully. Too long and it might feel intense or improper. Too short and it could seem shy or worse, disinterested. Those tiny glances carried volumes. Then there were hands and gestures. A slight brush of a hand when passing something, holding a fan just so, or even the way someone arranged their gloves could signal attraction. Every movement was deliberate but natural, meant to show attention without overstepping social boundaries. For example, a lady fanning herself slowly could subtly indicate she was aware of someone's gaze, and maybe even return the interest. Conversations in courtship were another layer of the dance. Unlike casual small talk, romantic conversation had a hint of personal attention but stayed within polite boundaries. Gentle teasing, thoughtful questions about opinions, or mentioning shared interests were all common. Direct statements about affection or desire, not yet. Everything was indirect, letting the other person read between the lines. It was subtle enough to feel safe, but noticeable to the observant. Music and dancing also played a big role in Victorian flirting. The way someone moved on the dance floor, or even just asked for a dance, could send signals. Offering a hand for a dance wasn't just about enjoying the music. It was about showing confidence, respect, and interest. Similarly, choosing not to dance with someone could send a polite, yet clear message. Every choice, from song to seating arrangement, mattered. Another interesting tool was letters and notes. When face-to-face flirting wasn't enough, or when social rules made direct conversation difficult, people wrote notes. These weren't just casual, "Hey, how's it going?" texts. They were carefully worded, polite, and often filled with subtle hints. Compliments were indirect, playful, and crafted to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Receiving a note could be thrilling, like a secret conversation happening through paper. The role of chaperones added another layer. Many social interactions happened with a chaperone present, especially for young women. That meant all flirting had to be discreet. Meaningful glance, a careful question, or a slight smile might be all you could manage, but that was enough. Victorians were masters of reading these small signals and understanding intentions without breaking the rules. It's important to note that flirtation wasn't just about attraction. It was also about showing social grace, intelligence, and charm. Being too forward could ruin a reputation, but being too shy could make someone seem cold. The goal was balance, showing interest, being playful, and maintaining elegance. Even body language had rules. Leaning in slightly during conversation suggested interest, but not too much. Tilting the head, light touches on objects, or turning the body slightly toward the person you were talking to, all subtle, all meaningful. Flirtation in the Victorian era was about suggestion and nuance, not declaration. And here's a fun thing. Much of this might feel familiar today, even though the style was different. Eye contact, playful teasing, thoughtful questions, and subtle gestures are still key parts of flirting. But the Victorians made it an art form, layered with social awareness and elegance. Finally, courting rituals, like formal visits, walking together, or attending events, were all part of the dance. Invitations had to be polite, Timing had to be precise, and every step observed the rules of decorum. A successful courtship wasn't about rushing. It was about building trust, showing respect, and letting affection grow naturally. In short, Victorian flirting and courtship were all about subtlety, attentiveness, and style. Everything you did, eye contact, hand gestures, conversation, dancing, even letters, sent messages. And reading those messages correctly, that was the real skill. Once flirting and courtship were underway, the next layer of Victorian dating life was all about expectations, from society, family, and even yourself. Unlike today, where dating is often private and casual, Victorian relationships existed within a larger social framework. How you behaved, who you spent time with, and even how you expressed interest all mattered, not just to you and your potential partner, but to everyone around you. Family involvement was huge. Parents or guardians often had the final say in whether a courtship could progress. A gentleman might need the blessing of a lady's father or mother before even asking for an official visit. And for young women, having a chaperone during meetings was the norm. This wasn't just about supervision. It was a way to signal respect, protect reputations, and maintain proper social standing. Because family and social circles were so influential, every interaction carried weight. A casual misstep, arriving late, speaking too freely, or appearing overly familiar could ripple outward, affecting how others perceived you. Politeness, attentiveness, and consistency weren't just nice, they were essential. Small gestures, like offering to help carry a coat or walking on the proper side of the street, weren't meaningless. They showed respect, reliability, and good manners. And then there's the delicate topic of rejection. Victorian society expected rejection to be handled with grace, whether you were the one saying no or being turned down. Public displays of disappointment or hurt were frowned upon. Instead, you had to respond calmly, politely, and with dignity. A gentle refusal might sound like, "I'm afraid our interests do not quite align at this time," or "I'm honored by your attention, but I must decline." Keeping composure wasn't just about manners. It preserved both people's reputations and kept social circles intact. At the same time, accepting interest gracefully was equally important. If someone expressed attraction, the response had to balance politeness with honesty. You couldn't be overly forward or presumptuous, but you also couldn't be cold or dismissive. A soft smile, measured conversation, and thoughtful gestures could indicate mutual interest without breaking decorum. Victorian etiquette also placed a big emphasis on consistency. Your behavior in one setting, at a social gathering, a dance, or even a walk in the park, should match your reputation. Being kind, composed, and attentive wasn't just situational. It was a reflection of your character. Social observers were everywhere, and reputations could form or crumble on small details. Another interesting aspect is how timing and patience played into courtship. Relationships weren't rushed. Letters, visits, dances, and formal outings were spread over weeks or months. This gave people time to gauge compatibility, understand intentions, and develop affection naturally. Rushing ahead could be scandalous. Taking time showed thoughtfulness and care. Even the smallest acts mattered. Sending a well-considered letter, offering a small but meaningful gift, or remembering details shared in conversation. These gestures weren't just romantic. They were evidence of attention, respect, and reliability. They signaled that someone valued both the person and the rules of society. Finally, the overarching lesson is this: Victorian dating etiquette wasn't about restriction for the sake of rules. It was about creating a framework where relationships could grow safely, respectfully, and meaningfully. Every curtsy, glance, conversation, and gesture contributed to a dance of social awareness, charm, and care. Even in moments of disappointment, composure and thoughtfulness were prized. In essence, dating in Victorian times required awareness, patience, and empathy. It was less about grand gestures or bold declarations, and more about subtlety, attentiveness, and respect for the person, their family, and the society that surrounded you. And while the details might seem distant or formal to us today, the core principles, listening, noticing, showing care, and navigating relationships with grace, are timeless. Once you've got the basics of greetings, small talk, and subtle flirting down, the next layer of Victorian dating was all about where and how people actually met and interacted. Unlike today, where you can text, swipe, or meet almost anywhere, Victorians relied on very specific social events to see each other in the right context. Balls and dances were probably the most famous venues. These weren't just parties, they were carefully orchestrated social experiences. Think of them as a mix of a live show and a networking event, but with dancing. Everyone had a role, men offering hands for dances, ladies gliding across the floor in flowing gowns, and everyone else observing with polite interest. Dancing wasn't just about fun, it was a way to signal charm, grace, and social awareness. The way someone moved could send messages of confidence, elegance, or even romantic interest. Then there were evening teas and afternoon gatherings. These were smaller, quieter, and more intimate than the grand ball. Ladies and gentlemen would meet in parlors or drawing rooms, sitting in carefully arranged chairs, sipping tea, and engaging in conversation. These settings gave people a chance to interact more directly, test their small talk skills, and read subtle cues from each other. For the younger crowd, walking in gardens or parks was a common way to meet and spend time together under polite supervision. A stroll could be simple, but every choice, the pace, the path, the direction, was observed and noted. Even sitting on a bench together could carry meaning, as long as it respected social distance and propriety. Visits and calls were also an important part of courtship. A gentleman couldn't just drop by unannounced. He needed to schedule a call through a chaperone or family member. Similarly, ladies received these visits formally, often in the presence of a chaperone. Each visit was structured: greetings, polite conversation, and carefully managed farewells. It sounds strict, but it created a framework where interaction was safe and meaningful. Even larger gatherings like garden parties or charity events were opportunities for courtship. Attending the same event, exchanging polite conversation, and showing attentiveness to others, actions were ways to build interest without breaking social norms. The key across all these venues was that context mattered. You couldn't just act however you wanted. Every move, glance, and word was observed, and reputations were built or adjusted based on what people saw. Social events were stages, and everyone was performing, subtly, elegantly, and within the rules of etiquette. If social events were the stage, then fashion and gestures were the costume and choreography of Victorian courtship. How someone looked, moved, and presented themselves could speak volumes without a single word being said. And in a world where conversation was carefully measured, your appearance often did half the talking for you. For women, fashion was not just about beauty. It was a statement of social awareness, taste, and even availability. Dresses were layered, often with corsets and crinolines, shaping the silhouette in a way that signaled elegance and refinement. Accessories like gloves, fans, and delicate jewelry weren't mere decoration. They were tools for subtle communication. For example, a lady holding her fan in a certain way could indicate interest or playfulness, and exchanging glances while adjusting it added another layer to the unspoken dialogue. Hairstyles, too, were part of the signal. Soft curls, carefully pinned hair, or delicate braids weren't just fashionable. They were markers of attention to detail and social skill. A well-styled hairdo told the room, "I care about how I present myself and I respect this occasion." And when paired with a soft smile or slight tilt of the head, it became part of the silent flirtation. Gentlemen, meanwhile, had their own visual language. A well-fitted suit, polished shoes, and neatly groomed hair weren't just about looking good. They communicated respect for the person you were courting and the society observing you. Hats were an essential accessory. Tipping or removing a hat at the right moment was an act of politeness, and even the style of the hat could indicate personality or status. A gentleman's gloves, cufflinks, or walking stick were subtle markers of taste and refinement, all of which could influence attraction without a single word. But beyond clothes, gestures and posture were equally important. Standing straight, moving gracefully, and using hands sparingly were signals of composure. Ladies would fold their hands neatly or rest them lightly on objects, while men might gesture lightly during conversation or hold their posture with a quiet confidence. These small movements created an impression of elegance, attentiveness, and self-control, qualities highly valued in Victorian courtship. Even the way someone walked or entered a room carried meaning. A lady gliding gracefully, making measured eye contact with acquaintances, and holding herself with poise could subtly signal availability or charm. A gentleman walking in with confident but unassuming steps, nodding politely, and offering small gestures of attention could convey interest without overstepping social bounds. Every movement was part of the language of attraction, as much as any word spoken in conversation. Accessories were not just decorative, they were tools of subtle communication. Fans, gloves, handkerchiefs, and parasols could all carry signals, from playful flirtation to gentle decline. For example, a fan held loosely in one hand could suggest openness to attention, while crossing arms or glancing down might politely indicate disinterest. Even the way someone handled a teacup or walked with a parasol could communicate intention. And let's not forget eye contact and facial expressions. A soft glance, a slight smile, or a thoughtful expression could speak volumes. Unlike today, where bold flirting might involve overt words or actions, Victorian courtship relied on these understated cues. Observant participants could read interest, hesitation, or amusement simply by noticing small shifts in expression or gaze. Fashion and gestures also worked together. A lady's flowing sleeve might catch a man's attention as she moved, or the tilt of a gentleman's hat might frame a smile perfectly. These visual interactions were like a quiet conversation, layered into the atmosphere of a social gathering. What's fascinating is that this visual language extended beyond the room. Invitations, letters, and gifts were all curated with the same attention to style, elegance, and subtle messaging. A well-chosen gift or a carefully written note didn't just show affection. It showed thoughtfulness, taste, and respect for the social framework that guided courtship. In essence, the way someone looked and moved in Victorian society was as much a part of romance as their words or actions. Clothing, posture, gestures, and accessories all combined to create a nuanced, elegant dialogue that could be understood by anyone familiar with the rules. And while it might sound formal, it was actually playful and creative, a way to show personality, interest, and charm without breaking etiquette. So the next time you picture a Victorian courtship, imagine a room where every glance, smile, and movement is carefully tuned. The dresses, suits, and accessories aren't just pretty, they're part of the conversation. The posture, gestures, and subtle cues aren't just manners, they're part of the dance. And that's what made Victorian dating both challenging and beautiful. A complex, visual, and social performance where attention to detail could speak louder than words. Now that we've talked about social events and the visual language of courtship, let's look at what actually happened when people spent time together. In Victorian times, a big part of dating, or courting, happened in public settings or during formal visits. And just like everything else, there were rules, subtle expectations, and ways to show interest without breaking decorum. First, let's talk about formal visits. Unlike today, where you can casually drop by someone's home or meet them for coffee, Victorians needed structure. Visits were scheduled, often arranged through a family member or a chaperone, and were brief but meaningful. A gentleman wouldn't simply walk into a lady's house. He'd announce his visit ahead of time and show up at the agreed-upon moment. A lady would receive him politely, often in a parlor or drawing room, and the conversation would be carefully guided by social norms. These visits weren't just about talking, they were about observation. Every gesture, expression, and movement was noted. How a lady greeted her guest, how she sat, how she spoke, all of it communicated refinement, attention, and manners. Similarly, a gentleman was expected to show politeness, composure, and subtle attentiveness. Offering a seat, removing a hat at the right moment, or carefully choosing conversation topics were all part of the silent performance. Speaking of conversation, this was another critical part of public courtship. Unlike small talk at a casual gathering, conversation during a formal visit had its own rhythm. Topics were safe and polite: books, theater, art, family, or light anecdotes. Asking too directly about feelings or personal matters was considered forward, while too much silence could seem awkward or disengaged. The ideal conversation balanced attentiveness, subtle humor, and curiosity without overstepping boundaries. Listening was as important as speaking. Victorians valued people who could respond thoughtfully, not just talk endlessly. Pauses were okay, even desirable. They showed consideration, thought, and composure. Interrupting or dominating a conversation, no matter how witty or interesting, was frowned upon. It wasn't about impressing others with intellect. It was about making them feel seen, respected, and comfortable. Public courtship also happened in shared spaces outside the home. Parks, gardens, walks along promenades, or public gatherings like concerts and exhibitions. In these spaces, rules were just as important. You couldn't simply stand next to someone and talk freely. Movements, distance, and timing all mattered. A gentleman might walk slightly ahead or beside a lady, offering to open gates or assist with steps. A lady might show polite interest through glances, gestures, or light conversation, all under the watchful eye of chaperones or onlookers. One of the most interesting aspects of public courtship was balance. Being too forward could lead to scandal. Being too distant could signal disinterest. Every glance, smile, and movement had to be measured. Even standing too close while walking or leaning too far during conversation could be noticed and judged. Essentially, Victorian courtship in public was a dance of proximity and subtle signals, each step carefully considered to show interest while respecting social norms. Letters and notes also played a big role in public courtship. If direct interaction was limited by time, location, or supervision, correspondence was the way to communicate feelings and intentions. But even letters had to follow etiquette. Polite wording, thoughtful phrasing, and subtle hints were essential. A well-written note could convey admiration or affection without appearing inappropriate, and it could often spark further interaction in a socially acceptable way. Another layer was time management. Courtship wasn't rushed. Visits, walks, and letters were spaced out to allow reflection, observation, and anticipation. Acting too quickly could be seen as desperate or improper. Waiting for the right moment, paying attention to cues, and responding appropriately showed maturity, thoughtfulness, and respect. Finally, it's important to understand the purpose behind all this structure. It wasn't just about rules for the sake of rules. It was about creating a space where relationships could develop safely, respectfully, and thoughtfully. Every gesture, every word, every step in a formal visit or public outing was designed to build trust, show attentiveness, and gradually deepen affection. So when you picture a Victorian couple on a stroll in a garden or seated in a parlor, it wasn't just casual hanging out. It was a carefully choreographed interaction, balancing interest, politeness, and social expectation. And while it might feel slow or rigid compared to today, that structure allowed people to show character, charm, and intention in ways that were meaningful and socially respected. Once you've gotten comfortable with public courtship and formal visits, the next step in Victorian dating was all about the rituals that showed interest. These were the small, intentional actions that signaled attraction, care, or curiosity, without ever being too forward. One of the most common ways to show attention was through gift giving. And this wasn't about expensive presents or flashy displays. Even a simple token, a flower, a book, or a small trinket carried meaning. Each item was chosen thoughtfully, signaling that the giver was attentive and considerate. For example, giving a lady a particular flower might express admiration, while selecting a book or poem showed that the gentleman knew her tastes. These gestures weren't just romantic, they were also a reflection of good manners, taste, and thoughtfulness. Attending events together was another ritual. Being seen at a concert, art exhibition, or dance with someone wasn't casual. It sent a subtle signal of interest. And again, it wasn't about being bold. It was about showing presence in a polite, socially acceptable way. Even sitting near each other during a performance or sharing observations quietly created a connection, without anyone needing to say, "I like you." Letters and written notes were essential to these rituals. A carefully worded note could communicate admiration, gratitude, or curiosity. Writing wasn't rushed, it was deliberate. You couldn't just jot down whatever came to mind. The tone, phrasing, and even the choice of stationery mattered. And because people often read letters aloud or kept them as keepsakes, clarity and politeness were crucial. Gestures during conversations were also subtle but meaningful. A gentle touch on a hand when passing an item, leaning slightly forward to show interest in what someone said, or offering a small compliment. These were all signals of attraction. They were never overdone or obvious. The idea was to communicate attention, curiosity, and respect all at once. Another ritual that might surprise modern listeners was shared walks or outings. A stroll through a park or along a promenade was more than exercise, it was a social dance. The way someone walked beside another person, offered to open a gate, or guided them over steps was carefully observed. These actions weren't just polite, they were a way of showing attentiveness and care without breaking social rules. Even the timing of interactions was meaningful. Repeatedly visiting or attending events with someone could indicate growing interest, while spacing interactions evenly showed thoughtfulness and self-control. Victorian courtship wasn't rushed. It was built on patience, observation, and small steps that gradually created connection and trust. Reading subtle cues was equally important. A slight smile, a lifted eyebrow, or a soft laugh could be a sign of interest. A polite glance or a careful pause in conversation could signal reflection or consideration. Learning to notice these small details and responding appropriately was central to understanding someone's feelings. One fascinating thing about these rituals is how they combined social etiquette and personal expression. Every small act, whether giving a flower, writing a note, or offering a quiet compliment, followed the rules of society but also allowed individuality to shine through. It was a way to express personality, taste, and affection while staying within socially acceptable boundaries. Finally, it's important to understand the purpose behind all these rituals. They weren't just formalities. They were ways to build trust, show attentiveness, and develop affection gradually. Each gesture, gift, or interaction added to a larger picture of mutual interest. The rituals created space for romance to grow safely and respectfully, while still allowing people to communicate subtly and elegantly. In short, Victorian courtship was less about grand declarations and more about thoughtful, deliberate actions. It was a mix of gestures, gifts, written words, and shared experiences, all designed to show care, respect, and interest. And while it may seem slow or formal compared to modern dating, the principles behind it, attention, thoughtfulness, and subtle communication, are things we can still appreciate and learn from today. So we've talked about social events, fashion, subtle gestures, and the little rituals of Victorian courtship. Now let's get into something that might feel a bit tricky: handling rejection, social pressure, and reputation. In Victorian times, dating wasn't just private, it was a public affair, and how you managed these moments could shape your social life for years. First off, rejection was part of the process, just like today, but it had to be handled with extreme care. A young lady or gentleman could politely decline a suitor without hurting their feelings or causing a scene. Saying no wasn't rude, it was an art form. Something as simple as, "I'm honored by your attention, but I must decline," was polite, clear, and graceful. How you responded, or received a response, showed a lot about your character. The key was composure. Victorian society valued calm, measured reactions. Expressing frustration, disappointment, or hurt publicly could damage a reputation. If someone was turned down, they were expected to accept it politely, perhaps with a small smile or a courteous nod. Overreacting could be seen as dramatic, immature, or socially clumsy. And in a world where social circles were tightly connected, one misstep could ripple outward. Social pressure was another factor. Families, friends, and acquaintances often had opinions on courtship. Choosing the wrong partner, ignoring expectations, or behaving too forwardly could attract criticism or gossip. So every action, from where you walked, to how you spoke, to whom you spent time with, was observed and judged. Learning to navigate this pressure gracefully was essential. People learned to balance personal desire with societal norms, showing respect for both their own feelings and the rules of decorum. Reputation, in particular, was everything. A person's standing in society could open doors or close them. Being known as polite, attentive, and composed was crucial. Even minor missteps could affect marriage prospects, social invitations, and how seriously others took you in future courtships. That's why every gesture, conversation, and interaction had weight. Your reputation wasn't just about what you did in private. It was about how the world perceived your character and judgment. Victorians also learned resilience through etiquette. Courtship wasn't always smooth. Rejection, misunderstandings, or awkward interactions happened, but how you handled them mattered more than the events themselves. Responding with grace, staying composed, and moving forward politely helped maintain respect and preserve relationships for the future. Even the smallest actions contributed to your social image. How you walked away after a declined invitation, how you responded to a compliment, or even how you smiled in conversation all reinforced or undermined your reputation. Attention to these details wasn't just about rules. It was about creating an impression that reflected maturity, kindness, and poise. At the same time, supportive friends and family could guide you through these challenges. A well-placed word of advice, a subtle introduction, or a reminder of proper etiquette helped people navigate the tricky waters of courtship without missteps. Victorian dating was very much a team effort in that sense. Individuals were accountable to themselves, but they also had a network helping them stay on course. The overarching lesson here is simple. Victorian courtship balanced personal feelings with social awareness. You could like someone, express interest subtly, or decline gracefully, but everything was done in a way that maintained dignity for both people and kept society's expectations in mind. This wasn't about stifling emotion. It was about expressing it thoughtfully, making sure interactions were meaningful, respectful, and polished. So when you think of Victorian dating, don't imagine it as just stiff rules or old-fashioned rigidity. It was a carefully structured social system designed to help people connect safely, respectfully, and thoughtfully. Even rejection, social pressure, and maintaining reputation were part of this framework, ensuring that relationships could develop without unnecessary scandal or heartbreak. In modern terms, it's a bit like dating with both mindfulness and social awareness. You notice cues, pay attention to etiquette, and handle disappointment gracefully. The details might differ from today's world of texts and casual meetups, but the principles, kindness, attentiveness, and respect, are timeless. One of the most interesting things about Victorian dating is how much the season influenced social life and courtship. Unlike today, where you can meet someone at a coffee shop, a party, or even online anytime, Victorians planned their social interactions around the calendar. Certain months, events, or even the weather could determine when and how people saw each other. Spring was a popular time for young couples to begin interacting more freely. Gardens were in bloom, parks were open, and the warmer weather made walks and outdoor gatherings both appealing and socially acceptable. A walk in a garden wasn't just a stroll. It was an opportunity to show attentiveness, taste, and charm. Gentlemen might point out a particularly beautiful flower, offer to steady a lady over a small step, or simply engage in light conversation that built rapport. Ladies, in turn, could respond subtly with gestures, glances, or comments that signaled interest without breaking decorum. Summer brought larger events like balls, charity galas, and garden parties. These were the high season of social life, where courtship could accelerate. People attended with full awareness that every glance, every gesture, and every conversation could influence their reputation and relationships. Dance cards, carefully chosen outfits, and polite conversation were all part of the game. Even the timing of an invitation mattered. Arriving too early or too late could be noticed, and choosing which dances to accept or decline could subtly indicate preference or interest. Autumn often signaled more intimate gatherings and family-centered events. With the harvest season and cooler weather, people might meet for afternoon teas, evening parlors, or literary salons. These smaller settings allowed for quieter conversation, more personal attention, and subtle testing of compatibility. Here, letters might be exchanged, small gifts presented, and gentle flirting practiced in a controlled environment. Autumn also brought the idea of preparation. Families and individuals often began thinking seriously about the future, so courtship could become more intentional. Winter, of course, was the season for indoor activities. With harsh weather limiting outdoor gatherings, families and social circles focused on home-based events, dinners, and seasonal celebrations like Christmas. These intimate settings allowed couples to interact more closely under the watchful eye of family or chaperones. Music, dancing, and shared meals became opportunities to display grace, attentiveness, and charm, all while staying within the bounds of propriety. What's important to understand is that seasonal events dictated not just where people met, but also how they interacted. Outdoor events allowed for subtle movement and casual conversation, while indoor gatherings emphasized composure, careful dialogue, and subtle attention to gestures. Fashion even adapted to the seasons. Lighter dresses and brighter colors in spring and summer, more layered and formal attire in autumn and winter. This was all part of a carefully orchestrated social rhythm, designed to maximize opportunities for courtship while respecting social norms. Modern listeners might find this fascinating because, in some ways, it's not so different from today's idea of seasonal dating. Think about summer festivals, winter holiday parties, spring brunches, or autumn walks. The context and atmosphere shape interactions, moods, and even how we express interest. The difference is that in Victorian times, every season came with a clear framework, rules, and expectations, which made courtship more structured, but also surprisingly elegant. One of the things that makes Victorian dating so fascinating and a little tricky is how social class shaped every part of courtship. Unlike today, where dating is largely about personal connection, in the 19th century, your social standing played a huge role in how, where, and with whom you could interact. But even with these rules, people found ways to express interest, charm, and personality in ways that were meaningful. Let's start with the upper class. These were families with wealth, titles, and social influence. For them, dating or courting was highly structured. Balls, formal dinners, and exclusive gatherings were common, and interactions were observed carefully. A gentleman courting a lady of high social standing had to be not just charming, but also impeccably polite, attentive, and aware of every nuance. Even a small misstep could affect reputation or family approval. For upper-class women, family supervision was everywhere. Chaperones accompanied outings, and introductions had to be mediated by someone of authority, like a parent or elder relative. Their dress, mannerisms, and even the way they spoke had to signal elegance and propriety at all times. For men, it wasn't just about looking good. It was about demonstrating refinement, confidence, and awareness of the rules. Subtle gestures, careful conversation, and knowing when to offer attention were all part of showing suitability as a potential partner. Middle-class dating was a little more flexible but still had rules. People in these circles focused on respectability, education, and social mobility. Courtship often involved structured visits, shared activities like concerts or outings, and letter writing. The difference is that middle-class individuals had slightly more room for personality to shine through in conversation, gestures, and gift-giving. Social status mattered, but charm, intelligence, and thoughtfulness could make a bigger difference. Working-class courtship was even more informal, though still influenced by manners and propriety. Opportunities for private interactions might be limited, but small gestures, communal events, and local gatherings allowed people to express interest. Letters, shared walks, and community events were the main ways for relationships to develop. While the formal rules of etiquette weren't as strict, the principles of attentiveness, respect, and subtle signaling were still valued. Across all classes, there was a delicate balance between personal interest and social expectation. Even in informal settings, reputation mattered. How a person behaved in public could influence their prospects, and gossip could spread quickly. That's why, regardless of class, politeness, composure, and awareness of social cues were essential. Another interesting point is that class affected access to venues and seasonal events. Upper-class individuals attended large balls, garden parties, and exclusive gatherings. Middle-class courtship relied more on cultural events, literary societies, and smaller social functions. Working-class interactions often revolved around community gatherings, fairs, and local celebrations. Each context shaped not only who you could meet, but also how interactions were structured. The takeaway for modern listeners is that while Victorian dating rules might feel rigid, they were designed to help people navigate attractions safely and thoughtfully. Whether through subtle gestures, careful conversation, or attending the right event, individuals of every class found ways to express interest while respecting social norms. It's a reminder that even in very structured systems, creativity, charm, and personality always find a way to shine. So, when we think about class in Victorian dating, it's not just about wealth or status. It's about how access, opportunity, and social expectations influenced the way people courted and connected. And even with those boundaries, people still managed to find ways to communicate interest, build relationships, and enjoy the dance of courtship in their own unique ways. One of the coolest things about Victorian dating, especially for modern listeners, is how people communicated their feelings in private. Unlike today, when a text or DM can say everything, Victorians had to rely on letters, notes, and subtle signals to show interest, express affection, or continue a courtship. And honestly, it's kind of charming to think about. Let's start with letters. These weren't quick, casual messages. They were carefully written, thought out, and deliberate. Writing a letter meant you were taking the time to express yourself clearly, politely, and tastefully. Every word mattered. Compliments were indirect, feelings were suggested rather than declared outright, and tone was always polite. The right phrasing could show admiration without overstepping boundaries. A single letter could build anticipation, strengthen a connection, or even set the stage for a future meeting. Then there were secret notes, smaller, sometimes playful messages passed during gatherings, walks, or even left in subtle places. These were usually short, sweet, and often filled with gentle hints of interest. A note might simply express enjoyment of a conversation, mention a shared joke, or signal that the writer wanted to see the other person again. What's fascinating is how these tiny messages carried so much meaning without saying anything too bold. They were like whispers of interest in a world where discretion was everything. Chaperones made private communication tricky, but also creative. People found clever ways to exchange letters, sometimes handing them through a trusted intermediary or leaving them in an agreed-upon spot. Even folding a note in a particular way or choosing certain stationery could communicate thoughtfulness or attention to detail. The Victorians were masters of subtlety. Beyond written communication, there was also a lot of nonverbal signaling that could be private, even in public. A shared glance, a soft smile, or a slight gesture could all function like a silent message. Think about leaning in slightly during a conversation, laughing quietly at a joke, or offering a polite compliment in passing. These small, almost invisible signals kept the connection alive while still following social rules. One of the interesting things about these private communications is that they built anticipation. You didn't just see someone and immediately know how they felt. You waited for letters, for notes, for those subtle gestures, and that waiting made everything feel more meaningful. Every interaction was considered, thoughtful, and deliberate. It's kind of like slow dating, but with a lot more elegance. Gift-giving sometimes tied into these private exchanges, too. A small token might accompany a note, a pressed flower, a favorite book, or a tiny keepsake. These gifts weren't extravagant. They were personal, thoughtful, and symbolic. Combined with written words, they created a layered way of showing interest that could feel intimate, even under the watchful eyes of family and society. For modern listeners, it's fun to compare this to texting or DMs, but slower, more deliberate, and more meaningful in some ways. Every word, every little gesture, every small gift was designed to communicate interest, build connection, and respect social boundaries at the same time. The Victorians were essentially experts at balancing desire and discretion. So, letters and secret notes weren't just tools, they were part of the art of courtship. They allowed people to express affection, flirt subtly, and deepen relationships in ways that were creative, thoughtful, and socially elegant. And honestly, reading between the lines of a Victorian note can feel like decoding a secret love language, which makes it all the more charming, all right? We've come to the final part of our Victorian dating journey. By now, we've covered greetings, social events, fashion, gestures, letters, and all the subtle ways people flirted and connected. But what happens when things don't go perfectly? Misunderstandings, rejection, or awkward moments were part of the process, and the Victorians had their own ways of handling them, ways that might actually be useful for us today. First, let's talk about misunderstandings. In a world of subtle glances, small gestures, and indirect communication, it was easy to misread a signal. Maybe a smile was interpreted as interest, or a polite comment was taken as flirtation. When this happened, the key was composure. Staying calm, polite, and considerate was the best way to smooth things over. Instead of overreacting or confronting the other person dramatically, a gentle correction or a graceful adjustment in behavior was expected. Basically, they believed in keeping the interaction classy, even when things got a little confusing. Now, rejection, everyone experiences it, and the Victorians had a very clear philosophy: handle it with dignity. If someone declined your courtship or wasn't interested, the polite response was to accept it calmly, thank them for their time, and move on respectfully. Showing frustration, embarrassment, or desperation was socially frowned upon and could hurt your reputation. The focus was on mutual respect. Leaving the interaction with grace preserved both people's dignity and kept future interactions possible. Even small details mattered here. How you smiled, how you spoke, or even how you exited a room could leave a lasting impression. A calm farewell or a polite nod communicated maturity and self-control, while any hint of overreaction could undo all the effort you'd put into building rapport. Think of it as handling a breakup, but in a way that leaves everyone feeling respected and intact. Maintaining dignity wasn't just about handling rejection, it applied to every part of courtship. Public and private interactions, gestures, and even letters were all opportunities to show composure, politeness, and attentiveness. If you could navigate misunderstandings and awkward moments while staying graceful, people saw you as reliable, thoughtful, and emotionally intelligent. These traits were highly valued, sometimes even more than looks or wealth. Family and social observers added another layer. Because courtship was public and reputation mattered, how you handled awkward situations could ripple outward. A well-managed rejection or misunderstanding reinforced social standing, while a poorly handled one could create gossip or judgment. So maintaining composure wasn't just personal, it was social strategy. The bigger picture is that Victorian dating was all about balance. You had to manage your feelings, express interest subtly, respect social rules, and navigate misunderstandings gracefully. And even when things didn't go perfectly, there was a clear way to handle it, with calm, respect, and poise. For modern listeners, the takeaway is surprisingly relevant. Even today, misunderstandings, awkward moments, or rejection are part of dating. Handling them with kindness, honesty, and composure can make all the difference, not just in preserving relationships, but in showing emotional intelligence. The Victorians just added a layer of elegance and structure that made these lessons feel like a carefully choreographed dance. So in the end, Victorian dating might feel formal or old-fashioned at first glance, but the principles behind it, attention, subtlety, respect, and dignity, are timeless. From the first glance at a social event to the last note exchanged, everything was about connecting thoughtfully, showing care, and navigating relationships with grace. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into Victorian dating. From the very first curtsy and polite greeting, to the subtle gestures, fashion, letters, and even handling those tricky moments of rejection, we've seen just how intricate, thoughtful, and honestly, kind of charming this whole world of courtship was. What's really cool is how much of it still makes sense today. Paying attention, being thoughtful, communicating with care, and showing respect. These are things we can all take inspiration from, even if we're not curtsying in a ball gown or sending handwritten notes. It's like the Victorians had this slow, mindful dating game that forced people to really notice each other. And I think there's something we can all learn from that in our fast-paced world. If you've enjoyed hanging out in these Victorian parlors, decoding gestures, walking through gardens, and reading secret notes with me, stick around. There's plenty more history, quirky social norms, and stories from the past that are perfect for chilling out, learning a little, and just enjoying the vibe. So whether you're here for the charm, the fashion, or the awkwardly polite flirting, remember, Victorian dating was all about connection, subtlety, and grace. And in the end, that's not too different from how we try to navigate relationships today, just with a few more layers, frills, and rules. Thanks for tuning in to MoonieGuide. We'll see you in the next deep dive into the weird, wonderful, and sometimes downright peculiar world of history. Good night from MoonieGuide.